But let's talk for a second about the language of instruction. It is in English. You must write all of your homework assignments. You must write the exam in English. No credit will be given to anything written in Hebrew. When it comes to being in class, we're going to do things on the honor system where I'm going to ask you to ask questions in English, make comments in English. And if you feel like in the moment you're stuck and you just have to get it out in Hebrew, I'll let it slide. So that's on the honor system. No recordings on Zoom, but I will upload last year's lectures. You're responsible for any differences that may arise. Nothing major, but there are going to be some small things. Tentative schedule at the end of the slides, emphasis on tentative. Lecture notes, I'm going to be giving them out. Today's lecture notes, like on the gravity model, is just what you see on the slides. There's not going to be written notes, but every lecture is going to have something. The main reference is this one by Krugman, Oswald, and Mellitz, International Economics Theory and Practice. I'm using one of the more recent editions, but actually they're all virtually the same from our point of view. If you go back to a version, older versions that don't have Mark Mellitz, then when we get to the part of the class on firms, it's going to be a little bit out of date. Okay. There are the prerequisites, problem sets, 4 problem sets. The top 3 grades that you have count. It's graded on, did you make a legitimate shot at it rather than did you get the question right? I really hope that I'm not going to be the one doing the grading. We're currently looking for the grader for the class. That's been dragging on longer than I'd like. Most of the grade is the exam. So far, any questions? So far, so good? Yeah. Sure. Okay, so first of all, what is international economics? International economics is maybe the wrong term for this class. International economics actually makes up at least 2 major fields. The first one is trade theory, international trade. That's going to be the bulk of this class. So trade theory asks questions like, why do countries trade? Now, sometimes the answer to that is obvious. Here we can grow oranges, and in Iceland they can't. So why do we trade oranges between Israel and Iceland? Well, because they can't grow them there. Sometimes it's not so obvious. Why do Germany and America trade cars amongst themselves? They both can make cars. Why do they bother to trade across the ocean? That's expensive. So the next question we're going to ask is, which goods and services are traded? Which country should be exporting what? We're going to start with the what I'm going to call the classic trade theory. But that's going to say that there's differences in technology and endowments. So you can think America has better technology than Mexico. So America is going to export more computers to Mexico, and Mexico will export other things. Or you can think endowments. America has more capital, so it's going to export things.
What's endowments?
That's the first part of the class.
I don't know.
Economies of scale and variety. This is actually 2 parts. The first part about economies of scale is what I'm going to call external economies of scale. We'll get to that when we get to that. The second part is internal economies of scale. When a firm itself increases production, its average costs come down. That's going to fall into new trade theory. So that came up in the 1980s. So part of this class is going to be going over the history of economic thought of trade theory. The classic stuff goes back to Ricardo, the early 19th century. And then the firm heterogeneity, this is the stuff that Mark Mellitz really became famous for just in the last 20 years. When we get to that stuff, if you have an old edition of the textbook, it's going to be out of date. But just for that stuff. Questions that we're going to ask: how does trade affect welfare? Who wins and loses from trade? We're going to, at the end of the class, spend at least 2 lectures talking about trade policy. So how to think about tariffs, things like that. If I have extra time at the end, I might. I'm going to talk about some topic that interests me. It might be about trade and demographics. So there are some very interesting papers about how trade affects women's labor force participation rates. Or I might talk more about trade and inequality. This has become an especially large issue in the last 15 years since China joined the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and it started exporting like crazy. So I've been thinking about doing a day on, it's called in the literature, the China shock. So talk about all the ways in which the China shock has affected the US. International finance. I'm going to actually do a class about international finance next week. I think it's really important to do some of the basics before we get into trade theory. International finance is largely talking about things like capital flows. Who lends money to whom and why? In the background, when we talk about capital flows, we're always thinking about exchange rates also, setting the price. Maybe today I'm going to talk about the home equity bias puzzle. Why do people in Australia invest so much money in the Australian stock exchange? Why don't they diversify more internationally? I might not, because we have the Hafsakat Limudim. Other big things. In general, you should think of this as open economy macro. So the extension of what we did in macro bet when we got to international stuff. Things that also might fall under the umbrella of international economics that I'm not going to talk about in this class are development economics. So roughly speaking, when economists look at the world and they see some areas like maybe Africa are poor and other areas are rich, there are two fields that talk about that. One is called development economics. That asks the question, why are countries in Africa poor? The other field is growth economics. That's more of a subset of macro. That asks the question, why is America rich? Up until 200 years ago, everybody was poor. So yeah, we're not going to talk about that. Climate change, biggest issue of the day. I don't have anything that interesting to say except for the fact that it's the most interesting issue of the day. Sorry about that. Migration, also a big field, clearly related to these two topics. Not going to get into it. So apologies, not enough time. Okay, so again, this is all what's up here, except for I want to emphasize this last part. Who is this class geared towards? First and foremost, this might annoy some of you, but first and foremost, what I'm thinking about here are students who are considering doing advanced degrees in economics. So you're going to see when I get into the models, especially of trade theory models, the first half of the class, I'm going to get into the models and I'm going to really get into them. So think about Diamond, Divik, and Harder. We're going to solve the Ricardian model and the Heckscher-Lin model in general equilibrium. That means setting all prices, wages, rental rates on capital, things like that, for two separate countries in autarky, and then when the world opens up to trade. Now, the reason that I'm doing this is because I wish somebody had done this for me when I was an undergrad. These models that we teach in international economics, I personally think of as really being the basis for understanding economic models in general. So if you're sitting in a lecture, in a seminar, often, even if the person isn't talking about international trade theory, the intuition that you get from these models comes up a lot, just in general in economics. Now, the reason for that is that this is one of the oldest fields in economics. It goes back 200 years. It goes back to David Ricardo. When economists were developing the field of economics, came from trade theory. So I'm not going to hesitate to really get into those models, get into them hard. I think it's really, really useful for building general intuition towards economics. The second class of students that I'm thinking about are students who want to work in the field. So especially when I get to the end, when I start talking about trade policy, I'm going to give a lot of terminology and a lot of things to think about for a student who might, for instance, want to be one of Israel's representatives to the World Trade Organization, or to go off and discuss what trade policy should be in the Knesset, something like that. So these are lexicographic. You guys are second on my list to these guys, but you are second on my list. The third one is general interest. Students who are just sort of interested in reading the newspaper, knowing what's going on. Great. I hope that this class is interesting for you guys also. Notice what's not here. The dog that did not bark. I did not put the bullet up here. Students who are looking for an easy English class. That's not up here. So students who are looking for an easy way to put a check mark off the I took a class in English because the Malag or Vatat or whatever made me do it, you're going to have a really hard time. And I hope you understand now why. Okay. So that's me being nasty rather than up here. This was not, I meant to take that off. Okay. So now let's go into the more general goal that I have for everybody. This is actually more for the third category of students, the general interest students. So I'm going to read to you a quote. We need a new economic paradigm because today America is part of a truly global economy. To maintain its standard of living, America now has to learn to compete in an ever tougher world marketplace. That's why high productivity and product quality have become essential. We need to move the American economy into the high value sectors that will generate jobs for the future. And the only way we compete in the new global economy is if we forge a new partnership between government and business. So think about this quote for a second. Take a minute to digest it. So just like a quick show of hands, is the person who made this comment a right-wing person, left-wing person, or sort of neutral? So who thinks that they're right-wing? Who thinks that they're left-wing? Left, okay. And who thinks that they're neutral? Okay. So I guess a lot of you guys said left-wing. I'm just going to guess because like the government has to get involved. Is that okay? Okay. The answer is that this is a made-up quote entirely. It was made up by Paul Krugman. Is part of your first problem set is to read his paper. It's called "What Do Undergrads Need to Know About Trade?" And he starts with this quote that he made up that he thought would represent a quote that you might hear from somebody more neutral talking in the news about 20, 25 years ago. I don't think anything has really changed. I still think you might read something like this in a newspaper today. And his goal of his article, "What Do Undergrads Need to Know About Trade?" is that undergrads need to be able to read this paragraph and understand why it's nonsense. It's just a lot of fancy words going by and no real understanding behind it. So that's part of your first problem set. But interesting that you guys thought it was left wing. I like that. Okay. A little bit on data. This is exports as a fraction of world GDP. So you can think about this as a measure of how much trade is going on over time. So notice that this was actually pretty high up until World War I. Then it shot down and only got back to its pre-World War I levels in like 1980 or so, and only really surpassed it around 2000 once China joined the WTO. So another part of your homework assignment tonight is going to be reading a paper that was written in 1999, so right around here. It's talking about two waves of globalization. What are the two waves from that author's point of view? The first wave was up until World War I, and the second wave was from World War II up until like 1980, 1990 or so. And what he's trying to say is, look, as a fraction of world GDP, these things were actually very similar. Both peaked at about 15%. But there were fundamental differences. So a big part of your reading on your first assignment is to get into what he thinks was going on. What is the history of world trade going on over here and going on over here, how they were similar, how they were different. This is one of those classics of international trade theory and international trade history. So I absolutely consider it mandatory reading. I always ask a question about this, this article on the exam, or at least I historically have always done that. The thing that's a little bit maybe annoying from you guys is that it's like 50 pages long. So if you'll notice, I gave you 3 weeks to do this problem set. I don't suggest waiting for the 3rd week. This is the hardest part. The other parts are much easier. But this is absolutely mandatory reading, and it's very, very interesting, I think. Okay, so far so good. Questions, comments, concerns? Okay, so how much time do I have? Okay, I have some time. This is in 2017, the major players in international trade. So on the left, you have in order, descending order of the value of the exports, the biggest exporters in the world, and the right, the biggest importers. So a few things should stick out. One is that China is the biggest exporter, and the United States is the biggest importer. So if you've been reading in the newspaper in the last few years, especially Donald Trump has made a big deal out of this, out of the trade deficit that America has, especially vis-a-vis China. It's been a big driving force in American politics. The other thing that I want to point out is that when you read these sorts of tables, you always have to be careful in understanding what is and is not going on. So for instance, if we look at Singapore, Singapore exports $373 billion a year of stuff, but half of it is about what's called re-export. So they're importing something and then they're immediately exporting it again. They're sort of just a pass-through hub. So people always have to be careful to understand what is and is not going on there. Okay, so that's just a quick warning about data in international trade. Okay, so some general numbers. About 35 to 40% of world trade is among developed nations. Now, in the jargon of trade theorists, this is called North-North trade, because historically speaking, richer countries have been in the North, so Europe, America. 30% is among developing nations, so that's South-South trade. So historically, poorer countries have been in the South. And the remainder is North-South trade. So something that we always have in the back of our mind is maybe we need different models for different types of trade. That's actually going to be something that's very true. So for North-North trade and South-South trade, or especially North-North trade, these sort of new trade models or new trade models that emphasize firms a lot, that's what's going to be really needed to understand what's going on there. Between North and South, the sort of classic trade models are still going to do a pretty good job. The other big thing going on is that 30 years ago, China was about 1% of global trade. Now it's about 20%. So what's going on with China? How's that affecting things? That's a big question. I hope that we'll get to it at the end of the semester. Okay, I'm going to skip this. Let's get into the gravity model. So the gravity model is the first model that we're going to have. This is actually absolutely going to be material for the exam, problem sets, all of that. The gravity model is a simple model that does a pretty good job of actually describing how much different countries trade with one another. So first of all, let's just say what's what. So yi is going to be the GDP of country I. Dij is the distance between country I and country j. And a is just some number estimated in the data. It's just a constant. So the gravity model says the amount of trade, T, between country I and country j is going to be approximately equal to this coefficient times the product of the GDP of both countries divided by the distance between them. The reason that this is called the gravity model is that it looks pretty reminiscent of the equation from physics describing how much force there is of gravity between two objects. That's a function of the mass of the both objects and the distance between them. So it's sort of similar. That's where the name comes from. And the idea you can think of is that if you have two really large economies that are sort of close to each other, they're going to be trading a lot. That's sort of the rough and tough intuition. So before getting into who, what, why, is this model good? Is this model bad? How do we interpret these things? Just in terms of the equation, is it clear what's going on? Okay. So let's think for a second, just intuitively, why is GDP multiplied in the numerator? So the idea is that both larger countries spend more on all goods. So if you're thinking about trade between Israel and Germany, or Israel and Cyprus, you might think that there's more trade between Israel and Germany just because Germany is a bigger economy. They should be wanting to buy more goods. It's also true that larger countries produce a wider variety of goods. So if you think about like when you go to the supermarket or the store, how many goods that you buy there were produced in Cyprus? Maybe one. Versus how many goods were produced in Germany? Well, there's a huge variety of that. So almost naturally, you're going to be spending more money on stuff produced in Germany just because they would produce a wider variety of things. So here's a way to think about it. What does trade between Israel and Germany look like? Well, you can think that if this is Israel's fraction of world GDP, maybe this is the amount of stuff it should be buying from Germany. So this, if this doesn't speak to you, if you like my other metaphor, that's fine. This is Israel's fraction of world GDP. This is Israel's fraction of spending. So that's how much of Germany's stuff Israel should be buying. Different way of thinking about it. If you understood my first metaphor better, that's fine. Can I get a show of hands who understood at least one of my metaphors? Okay, great. So we're good. All right, so let's do a little bit about data, showing that this does a good job. We're going to be picking on, by the way, this paper that this data is from is on Moodle. You don't have to read it. All you need to know is what I actually talk about in class, but it's there if you want to get more into it. Okay, so we're going to be picking on Japan for this example and comparing Japan with countries in the EU. The reason for that is that here I want to be emphasizing the role of GDP, the size of GDP, and abstracting from distance. So if you think about the distance from Japan to Greece, it's really the same as the distance between Japan and Germany. There's no real difference there. We can forget about that. They're all far away. So let's think about Japan's exports to the EU, to different countries in the EU. Greece is 1 on the x-axis. Greece's GDP is 1. A country with half of the size of Greece's GDP is 0.5. A tenth the size of Greece's GDP is 0.1, so you can think Lithuania is about there. 10 times the size of Greece's GDP is 10, so that's France, Germany, Great Britain, things like that. And on the y-axis, we're going to have Japan's exports. So what this is showing is that countries with larger GDPs get more exports from Japan. That sits pretty well with what the gravity model will tell us. These countries are larger. They should be buying more stuff. Well, they are. Flip side, Japan's imports from the EU, same thing. Larger countries export more stuff to Japan. They produce a wider variety of goods. Japan buys more from them. So cool, the gravity model does a decent job at first glance, at least in terms of the fact that richer countries trade more with one another. The numerator of our gravity model seems to work. Let's take a look at one more example. That's going to in a minute. We're going to come back to this. US trade with the EU. So here on the x-axis is percent of EU's GDP. So Spain is a little less than 10% of the EU's GDP. The UK is about 15%, Germany 20%. I guess this is out of date, right? Because the UK isn't in the EU anymore, but it still works. Percentage of US trade with the EU, it's sort of on this line. It makes sense. Bigger countries in the EU trade more with the US. Keep this in the back of your mind. We're going to come back to it in a minute. I want to talk now about the denominator in the gravity equation, this whole distance thing. So sometimes distance is actually very, very difficult to measure, because you can think about distance between two countries as being the way the crow flies, just a bird flying over. But if there's a huge mountain range or a big ocean in between them, well, trade is kind of difficult. So physical distance is what we have in mind in the gravity model. but which root sort of matters for how you might want to think about measuring that. There's also distance in linguistics, which language we use, in culture. There's also distance in trading costs. You can think of these as artificial distances between countries. If the US has higher tariffs on China than it does on the EU, well, that might affect the distance that we're thinking about. This is sort of similar to the whole, which route do you take? Holland is a major trading hub for the EU. A lot of goods that go to anywhere in Germany, wherever in the EU, they go through Holland. So you can think of Holland as being closer to some degree because a lot of the ships go through it anyway. It's a gateway country to Europe. And this one, regulations and policy, is pretty similar to trading costs. Israel is going through this whole reform, getting rid of like the Mechonat Tkanim, like if something's okay with the EU, then it's okay with Israel. That's not a direct trading cost, but it's sort of an indirect trading cost. It's a regulation. You can think of it the same way. Okay, so distance in what? Let's start by thinking about distance physically. So here's that old graph again with two additions. So let's start by, again, just over here, these are the EU countries, how big their GDP is, how much trade they do with the US, it's increasing. This is exactly what I showed you 2 slides ago. But now notice Canada and Mexico. Mexico's GDP is about the same size as Spain, Canada about the same size as Italy. But both Mexico and Canada trade a hell of a lot more than either Spain or Italy do with America. Why? There's no distance. They're right on the border. So this is the first sort of cutting example of the gravity model, distance mattering. Think about a different form of distance. This is cultural or linguistic difference. So the left thing, we're looking at France's exports to different countries. Every dot here is a different country. The green dots are former colonies of France. And the circled dots are countries that speak French. So countries that have a history with France, they used to be colonies of France, or speak French today, trade a lot more with France than other countries of similar distances. Culture sort of matters. Same idea with the France's imports. Okay, a little bit about the history of economic thought. The gravity model did not have very good theoretical foundations before 1995. So it was largely dismissed by economists. So if you were like, something that I'm trying always to emphasize in MacroBed and in this class is like the sociology of the profession. If you think about the sociology of international trade theorists, they used to be sort of the center of the profession in terms of the models that they were making. And it was this really important field. They were very, very theoretically based for a long time. The gravity model didn't have such good theory behind it. It had this sort of intuition, but no theory before 1995. Therefore, it was largely dismissed. Since 1995, it started coming out of the models. Models have changed a bit in this time period. Also around 1995, empirical economists started to make more of a headway into the field of trade theory, into international trade economics. And people started admitting, yeah, this is really a big part of what's going on is the gravity model. Distance matters and size matters. So people admitted that it was correct. It started entering the mainstream of models. And in 2008, it also entered into like these Melitz models, the new trade theory. So this is a quote that I just had to copy from the paper that I posted. One irony of the history of the gravity equation is that trade economists discovered the empirical importance of geographic distance and national borders, just as some prominent journalists and consultants had dismissed these factors as anachronisms. Thus, the business press was proclaiming the borderless world, the death of distance, and the world is flat, while empirical research was categorically demonstrating the opposite. So, I don't know, I read the New York Times every morning with my cup of coffee for 20 years now. And yeah, this is pretty accurate. Journalists have been talking about how distance doesn't matter anymore. The internet has made the world flat and anybody anywhere can do anything and trade with anybody. And we're going to have, you know, doctors in India robotically performing surgery on somebody in Texas, things like that. And what these guys are saying is, just as all the business world is coming and saying distance doesn't matter anymore, that's all over, the trade theorists were saying, whoa, this is a really big deal. We need to have this in our models. So it's like these two guys are like passing like ships in the night. So I really like that quote. Okay. So far, so good? I'm not just talking your ears off this morning? Yeah? Uh-huh. Oh, so the firm heterogeneity literature is the trade theory models based off of Melitz. So think about something that we'll get to later in the class, but firm heterogeneity in terms of some firms like Apple are really productive and other firms are not. So those models existed, they have a lot to say, and we'll get to them later in the class. But for a while, they came about around 2000, 2001. So it took like 7 or 8 years until people added the gravity model to them. That's what I'm saying. But yeah. Okay. Now let's talk about borders. Borders also matter a lot and can work as a form of distance between areas. So let's pick on British Columbia over here. British Columbia borders Washington and Alberta. California and Manitoba are similar distances from British Columbia. British Columbia and Quebec and New York are roughly the same distance away. So what I want to do is argue that this border between the US and Canada actually matters. So provinces or states of similar distances from British Columbia are going to have very different trade with British Columbia just because of that border. So Alberta and Washington both directly border British Columbia. How much of British Columbia's percentage of GDP is trade with Alberta? 7%, a little under 7%. With Washington, it's 2.6%. Manitoba and California are similar distances from British Columbia. British Columbia trades a hell of a lot more with Manitoba than with California. New Brunswick and Maine, similar. Ontario and Ohio, similar. Quebec and New York, similar story. This border between the US and Canada, even though there's a free trade agreement, really seems to matter a lot. So you can think that maybe it matters because, okay, there's a free trade agreement, nobody's going to stop you from moving stuff, but still the financial systems are separate, so payment is a little bit slower. You have to do regulation differences, maybe not. Maybe just word of mouth is different. Canadians don't advertise as much in America as they do in Canada, things like that. So this is a whole realm of literature getting into what's going on here. Why does the borders matter so much? Okay. Something that I think you guys probably know without me telling you, but I'm going to tell you anyway, is that trading costs have come down dramatically over time. So between 1930 and 2005, the green line is the cost of moving stuff by sea. So these days we have huge, huge container ships, and people are really good at taking these containers on and off the boats in ports. Costs have come down by about 80%. The red line is planes. Okay, maybe the fact that it's come down a lot by 1950, 1960 isn't that surprising. Planes back in the day were not so great, but it's actually continued to decline. Planes have gotten even more efficient over time. They use less fuel. And the one that's going to surprise absolutely nobody is that international calling has become basically free. So the cost of moving information is basically zero these days. So this, we're going to come back to this last point in a second, that moving information is basically free. Okay. I'll also point out that tariffs have come down. This is average tariff rates. In like the late 80s, early 90s, they were about 14%. They've come down since then. If you go back further in time to like after World War II, they were even higher, like 25%. The last topic that we're going to get to, until I get to my extra topics if I have time, is talking about trade policy, and we're going to go over the history of the trade agreements after World War II that brought down these tariff levels. So that's going to be part of the class. Okay, so what do we trade? So this is from 2006 to 2016. The y-axis is billions of US dollars. Blue, agriculture, pretty constant and not that important actually in world trade. The most important factor in world trade is this orange stuff. That's manufacturing goods. Think about this as anything that you physically put in a box, gets on a boat or a train and goes somewhere. This is by far, always has been and still is the most important factor of world trade. This green stuff is, I confused myself. I thought that this was going to be, I screwed myself up. This is all merchandise trade. This is all stuff that goes into stuff. All right, yeah, sorry. This green stuff is fuel and mining products. All right, what I wanted to say is just point out that this stuff comes to about $16 trillion. So this is a lot. It's mostly stuff that goes in boxes. Let's forget about the breakdown because we don't have that much time. Now let's talk about services. So one idea that people had was that the cost of information has gone down to zero. Trade and services should increase. Why pay an accountant in Israel to do my taxes when I can pay somebody in India to do it? They're probably cheaper. Communication with India is free. So it's true that trade and services has increased from 2006 to 2016. It's gone from about $3 trillion to about $5 trillion, but it's still less than a third of the trade in goods. This green part is other commercial services. That's where that accountant might fall if I'm hiring an accountant from overseas. So people are debating why this hasn't taken off as much as it has. Quick story, when I was on the job market and I came through to apply for a job here, I met with Sachi Gilboa, and Sachi does theory, I do macro. So what do we have to talk about besides like a cup of coffee or whatever? So he said to me, I used to be the department head. Do you want my canned speech about why you should move to Israel? I said, sure, hit me. What's your canned speech? And he started going on about how Israel is safe. He doesn't worry about where his kids are at night. And he was saying, and there's just enough of a language barrier and just enough of a security situation that you really just don't have to worry about. If you want your kid to be an accountant, they'll be an accountant and they'll have a decent job. That's what he said to me back then. I don't know if it's still true. So what was he talking about? Israel linguistically is difficult. Learning Hebrew is not the easiest thing in the world. So somebody who wants to come and do that is hard. And you can say that the communication, actually sending information between Israel and India is cheap, but everything else about that is difficult. All the cultural gaps, all the linguistic gaps are difficult. So that's not going away as fast. So let's skip this slide and go to here. So Alan Blinder is a pretty famous economist. In 2006, he made the following prediction. In the future, and to a great extent the present, the key distinction for international trade will no longer be between things that can be put in a box and things that cannot. It will instead be between services that can be delivered electronically over long distances with little or no degradation of quality, and those that cannot. So what's he saying? This was a prediction made 15 years ago. He's saying the way trade is going is that it's not going to be about making a new computer, putting it in a box and sending it overseas. It's going to be hiring that accountant from overseas. I send them all my information about my income in Israel. They prepare my tax return, and that's that. That's what he was predicting. What does the textbook, the most recent version of the textbook, say has actually happened? At this point, service outsourcing gets a great deal of attention precisely because it is still fairly rare. The question is how big it might become and how many workers who currently face no international competition might see that change in the future. So the textbook is taking the point of view that every time you hear about people in Israel or America hiring accountants in India, the reason you hear about it is because it is still rare. And because it is a source of anxiety, maybe this is going to be a big deal in the future, but we haven't quite gotten there yet. So all these predictions made over the last 15 years, maybe they'll come true, maybe they won't, but it's not as big of a deal yet as you might think. Okay. I think that this is a good time to stop. We'll pick up again at 1 o'clock. And hopefully, yeah, have a good time with, I don't know, whatever you guys are doing. Nobody filled me in.
Like a concert or something in the main area.
Oh, okay. And they didn't invite me. All right, let's continue. Unless there are any questions, comments, or concerns. Okay, so something that's sort of like a general known result in economics is that uncertainty about policy really bothers businesses. In recent years, there's been a fair amount of this, of policy uncertainty. Probably the two biggest surprises, I would say, that happened about 5 years ago. England decided to leave the European Union, and a few months later, Donald Trump was elected. Neither of these events were really well anticipated. Everybody sort of assumed the day before that they wouldn't happen. And both of them were largely aimed at international trade. So Brexit was largely about England getting control of its borders. And Trump, well, I mean, different people can disagree about what was the underlying phenomenon there, but a large part of what he was doing was railing against migration and trade with China. So a lot of people consider this a statement about international stuff. Okay. I don't remember why I put this before here. Probably should go after, but let's talk about this for a second. Then. All right, so what are some general ideas about trade? Why do countries trade? So if we go back to like Adam Smith, 1776, Adam Smith came along and said, let the free market just do its thing. The invisible hand brings everything to perfection. If you believe in market efficiency, if you think that that's the way things work, then an international border is just an artificial impediment to letting the market do its thing. And we should try our best to not let it be there. So free trade, don't let anything happen at the border. That would be a very Adam Smith point of view. That intuition, the general intuition, sort of stood the test of time for a while. So David Ricardo came along like 30 years later and said a big deal is productivity differences between countries. Some countries are better at some things than other countries are. In those sorts of models, the Ricardian models, that's going to be the next major model that we learn starting in 2 weeks. Even here, letting the market do its thing is going to bring the best outcome. It continues to be the case 100 years later when we get to the Heckscher-Lin model that looks at the fact that different countries have different endowments. Some countries have a lot of land, some countries have a lot of capital, a lot of labor, whatever. Even here, letting the market do its thing, not interfering, is going to bring the best general outcome. But as soon as we start talking about endowments, we're going to be able to say that some people win and lose from trade. So it's still going to be the case here that this general notion of ignore the border, free trade is going to bring about the most wealth overall, but it's going to also drive some inequality. Then we're going to start talking about other things such as market conditions. Some firms have economies of scale, like maybe there's a monopoly going on. Maybe competition is imperfect in some other ways. So here, arguments are going to start to become a little bit more sophisticated. So the first idea of economies of scale being important for trade actually dates back to the 1850s, and it's called the infant industry argument. So if you think for a second about Switzerland being really good at making watches, maybe they're really good at making watches because 500 years ago, somebody in Switzerland started making watches, and all the watchmakers just went to Switzerland. And all that information and knowledge just kept accumulating in Switzerland. But if we were starting over today and had to decide today where the watch industry was going to be, we might well pick Vietnam because labor is cheaper over there and they know how to make watches. Why not? It's not that complicated. So maybe if we were deciding today, the watch industry would be moved. So maybe historical accident, along with economies of scale, explains trade. And if you think that that's a story, maybe Vietnam, what they want to do is start protecting their watch industry to let it grow and eventually compete with the Swiss watch industry. That's the infant industry argument. If you didn't fully follow it, we'll put it off until the middle of the semester. Talk a bit about differences in firms, policy. A big deal today, especially with the coronavirus, people are talking about it a lot, is the growth of international supply chains. When Apple makes a computer, some of the parts are assembled in America, some in China, some everywhere. You have to have the ships moving around. It gets complicated. What happens when there's a shock like we're about to talk about and shipping becomes really expensive? Okay. So these are the general ideas that we're going to talk about when we talk about why do countries trade. Something that's going to be emphasized in your homework, something that once upon a time was obvious to everybody in the world, and about 300 or 400 years ago stopped being obvious to everybody in the world, is that the point of trade is to import, not export. So I want you to go back thousands of years ago. Pretend that you had a little village. You're growing some wheat, maybe had some sheep or something like that, a little village way back when. And somebody comes from the north and says, we have some wood. We'll give you some wood. You give us some of the food that you've grown. The reason that you would agree to that is not because you want to export. You want to keep the food to yourself. The reason you would agree to that is because you want the wood that the person from the north is offering you. Somehow along the way, people started thinking that what we should be doing is exporting as much as possible. This happened a few hundred years ago. The idea, the mentality of that time was called mercantilism. The idea was we want to export as much as possible and accumulate as much gold as possible when we export. Now, I'm starting the class sort of after mercantilism. I'm not going to get into a critique of it. What I'm hoping is that this critique is sort of obvious enough, along with what you're going to read in your homework, that the point of trade is to import, not to export. This is still true. The only time, when can you guys think of when might this not be true? And I'm going to give you a hint, think in terms of macro bet.
ירון, מה אחי?
מה?
למה אני מגיע?
That's sort of a China argument. China's doing like the Belt and Road initiative around the world. They're trying to build up in Africa to have influence over Africa. I can't deny that politics might play a role in things like that.
מה?
My only
סיימתי את כל
exception,
ההגרלות של היום.
rule, if we're thinking
יש להם את
strictly
הטלפון שלי.
economics
יש להם את
and not
הטלפון שלי.
politics, is something
יש
like
מספר שלך,
we're in a
מה הם אומרים לי
recession,
שלא?
אין
אין
להם.
קשר.
European style
יש
recession where
עוד
there's
עבודה
not enough
במחסן, זה
demand.
לא רק שינויים.
And
הם
there,
אמרו לך
what
כן,
was the
כרגע,
argument in
זה
macro
הכל,
bad is that
נעלמת
you
להם,
want the
לא יודעים
central
איפה
bank
אתה, הם
weaken
פשוט
the
שלחת
currency
הביתה.
to induce
סבבה.
more exports
כבר זה
in
הסתיים,
order to
אני
increase aggregate demand today.
אחזור עליהם.
But that's just to get us out of a recession.
עשה לי טובה,
That's not a general statement. You
במהלך
don't
היום
want to do that
אנחנו
all
באים
the
לפה
time.
להפסקה,
That would be the
או,
intuition from
אתה
macro
יודע,
bad.
אם יש איזה
That's the
הפסקה
only
באמצע
exception
היום,
I
אין
have
בעיה
to
לבוא
this
לפה. אתה יכול לשבת ללמוד שם, לא אכפת לי שאתה יושב
Okay.
ללמוד, גם אני יושב ללמוד, אתה רואה?
Another question
יש
that
זמן
we'll
יושבים
spend
ללמוד.
some time discussing
שב שם,
over the
ואז אם הם
semester.
צריכים אותך,
I'm not
אז
going to
תזמן
really
להם.
have too many
סבבה?
answers to give about it.
שמה עם כל הרעש, עם כל האנשים.
Trade effects and
אי אפשר
equality,
ללמוד
what do
שם.
we want to do about
עם
that?
הרונן
Do
המפגר
we want to
הזה.
stop trade or do we
כל
want to
שניה הוא
do
יבוא אליי,
something else to fight
יבלבל לי
inequality?
את המוח.
Or
תגיד
is that
לו
just
שאתה
כשאתה
כרגע
שם ורואים אותך
לומד.
ונגיש,
So that's
כבר
going to
יעשו
be
ממך
a topic that comes
עבד
up.
כמו שהם אוהבים.
אני עבדתי שם תקופה, אני יודע את העבודה
Okay, so
שם,
what's been
אני
going
מכיר
on
אותה, הייתי
recently?
לומד שם.
First of all, Brexit.
זה חלק מהתנאים.
It
אתה
seems
בא,
to
אתה מקבל
finally be
כסף, זה
biting. There
העבודה
are
שלך.
some
בזמן
reports of like
העבודה-
fuel shortages in England
אפשר
have been
להקשיב
coming
לזה,
from
אני שומע.
the fact that Brexit
אני
was done a
שומע.
little bit shakily.
אוקיי. בזמן
Not
העבודה,
everybody is upset
אתה צריך
about
להיות
it.
שם. אם זה לא מסתדר
It's
לך
a
עם
topic that I
הלימודים,
hope to get to later on.
העבודה היא קודמת.
Big thing that I do intend to talk
Sure.
about later in the
Listen.
semester,
טוב, תסיים את השיעור.
second trade policy lecture, is Trump's trade war with China. Now, there's sort of two things going on here in the background as to why Trump started a trade war with China. And it's really easy to miss what was going on. So if you listen to him talk, when he gets up and he starts railing about China, most of the time what he was saying is that there were huge trade deficits. That China is exporting way more to America than America is exporting to China. However, even before Trump got up and started his trade war, a lot of people were very concerned about unfair Chinese trade practices of other sorts. So I have a friend who has a small business here in Tel Aviv. And what she says is every time she starts selling to China, they copy her designs. And then a week or two later, somebody else can buy it on Alibaba. Her exact product that she made, except not hers anymore. So when we get to talking about this, we're going to differentiate between these two ideas. Are trade deficits with China a bad thing? I'm going to argue no. I'm going to get into that next week. What's driving these trade deficits, how to think about that. This whole thing about intellectual property and other potentially unfair Chinese trade practices, that is a really big deal. Not 100% clear what's the right way of talking about it, of addressing it. I'll talk about that again in a minute. So Trump started a trade war, jacked up tariffs, hurt a lot of Americans when the Chinese responded. So the Chinese raised tariffs on a lot of agricultural goods from America. This hurt a lot of American farmers. So Congress sort of bailed them out, tried to give them money, help them out. There was a lot of politics going on behind the scenes, obviously, about which goods got exempted from tariffs, which didn't. It's also been very interesting to watch the Senate Republican response. So historically, the Republicans have been on the side of free trade all the time and pushing reduction of tariffs. And the Democrats, if anything, have been more hesitant to do so. Just since Trump has been in office, things have a little bit flipped. So it's been interesting to watch people like how they say, oh, how do they like try to, what do they think about it? Now, the other interesting thing that Trump did was he shot down what's called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. So this was a trade agreement largely negotiated by Hillary Clinton while she was Secretary of State under Obama. What the TPP was doing was trying to create an agreement between America and a lot of countries in the Pacific area to lower tariffs, first of all, among them, but also to create a common front and rules as to trade and intellectual property, things like that, in order to confront China's trade practices together. So what's been interesting watching this is that if you actually believe that China is a threat because of intellectual property and bad practices, maybe TPP was a better approach than a trade war. Maybe not. Maybe you want to jack up tariffs and really go at China hard. I'm not saying otherwise, but it's not clear. If you think that it's all trade deficits, then sure, jack up, then maybe you don't want to lower tariffs with more countries and stuff like that, maybe you want to jack up tariffs. So this is something we'll talk about a little bit next week. We'll talk about trade deficits, China versus America, how to think about that, where they're coming from. And more towards the end of the class, I hope to talk more about unfair Chinese practices that sort of have more of a consensus that maybe this is not a good thing, that we don't want to have it going on. Simultaneously, okay, Trump started a trade war. It affected demand for American goods. Question is, how should the Fed respond to such a thing, to such an occurrence? There's a demand for, do we think that what's going on when the Chinese when there's a trade war is there a demand shock to America? The Chinese are buying less from America. Maybe that's a demand shock. If that's what you think is going on, then maybe the Fed should try to stimulate by lowering interest rates and intervening in the foreign exchange market. It's hard to know. Is it a supply shock? If it's a supply shock, what's going on is that, well, a lot of what America was importing from China was intermediate goods, steel that Americans used to make cars or things like that. Well, then there's not much the Fed can do against a supply shock. In macro bet, we only ever talked about fighting demand-induced recessions with the central bank, not supply-induced recessions. So not only does the Fed have to tell these two apart, but then issues of the independence of the Fed really needs to preserve the image of it being independent from presidential interference. So what actually happened, this was pretty interesting. Stanley Fischer came in and gave a talk at a conference here. He had been the second in command of the Fed, the vice governor. And so he was talking about how at some point the Fed wanted to lower interest rates. Then Donald Trump got on television and started yelling that the Fed needs to lower interest rates. So they didn't lower interest rates because they couldn't be seen lowering interest rates after Trump said to do so. They needed to preserve the view that they were independent. So that was Stanley Fischer's interpretation, not mine, of what was going on. Okay, it's kind of related to this trade war with China. If you think that what's going on is that people are pissed off more about the trade deficits and that there's this huge surge of exports from China, well, those surge of exports are actually hurting a lot of Americans. So there's been a huge increase in Chinese exports to the US since 1980, but especially since 2005, since they joined the World Trade Organization. This causes diffuse benefits, but concentrated costs. So when China exports a lot to America, for most people, the price of consumer goods goes down. They get to buy stuff cheap. That's a benefit for most consumers, but it's a small benefit relative to the people who lose their job in competition with China. Those people have large costs, but there are relatively few of them. So the estimates were that 400,000 jobs were lost due to this China shock. In the grand scheme of the American labor market, that's small. There are about 150 million people in the American labor market. So this is very small. But it's a lot of people in a few states that can give them a lot of political power, and they really care. So there's been a lot of research done about them. They had to change jobs a lot on their way to finding a new career. People who lost jobs to in competition with China, they had to bounce around for a while until they found the next thing. And on average, they lost about half a year's income due to this China shock. That's a big, big loss. There's also been research documenting that these people have seen a large increase in alcohol deaths and suicides. It really, really hurt them. And combining with, I'm not going to explain what gerrymandering is, but it's an aspect of American politics. So combined with the American political system, this has led to a lot of polarization. And some people say that this is also potentially a reason for Donald Trump winning the election, was that he was railing against China, and some important people, a significant amount of people lost their jobs and paid a large cost. Okay, so I hope to get to the China shock in the last lecture if I have time. Also, what's going on recently, coronavirus. So if you just look at US import data, you can see this is the .com bust, recovered fast. Financial crisis, recovered fast. Coronavirus, also actually recovered pretty fast, American imports. kind of interesting to see that the same is not true about exports. So recovered pretty quickly after the dot-com bust, pretty quickly after the financial crisis. Still a little bit slow in the recovery now with the coronavirus. Huge drop, so far somewhat mild recovery. All right, forget that one. Something that's been very, very important for understanding what's going on recently is to compare where trade has been hurt more. So during the financial crisis, this was a total decline in trade. It was about 10%. There was a greater decline in trade among goods and less of a decline of trade among services. During the coronavirus crisis, there was a huge drop in trade among services and less so among goods. Now, you can tell any story you want as to why this might be. A lot of trade and services maybe has to do with people physically interacting. You know, if I want to buy services from a financial firm, well, sometimes people have to actually meet to do so. But also a lot of what's going on is that people are stuck at home and they're just ordering more stuff online. So there's been a huge increase of demand for gym equipment, for instance. People building their own gyms at home because they can't go out. What's been interesting to see is this. Recovering demand, especially for goods, good demand has not been hit as much as service demand. It's caused people to demand more shipping than was expected. So when the coronavirus hit, everybody thought, oh, this is going to be a huge catastrophic recession. But demands for good has not dropped by as much as they thought. So this is if 100 is the price of a shipping container in April 2020, the price of those containers has gone up almost by a factor of 5 since then. Shipping has become very expensive over the last year and a half. Part of it was just misinterpreted, just people didn't know what to expect, and they guessed wrong as to how much demand for goods trades there was going to be. And it's called the Great Snarl, I think. There are a bunch of shipping containers off the coast of California sort of looking for a port to drop off their stuff in. Like global supply chains have been really screwed up by this. So most likely this is a temporary shock and it's going to be over within the next year. But in the meanwhile, this is really wreaking havoc on the world economy. Okay, so far so good. I'm going to switch topics and it's going to be rather abrupt. Okay, so let's do an abrupt switch of topics. This is going to be a major part of the lecture next week, but I'm going to give you the motivation for it now. What is the net international investment position? That was. It's how many foreign assets Americans own minus how many American assets foreigners own. The value of foreign assets owned by Americans less American assets owned by foreigners. So assets owned by Americans, let's pretend that I never came to Israel, that I stayed in Philadelphia, Boston. I'm an American living in America. I bought stock in an Israeli company. That's a foreign asset. It's an Israeli stock that is owned by an American. An Israeli bought an apartment in New York. The apartment is an American asset. It's in New York. It's now owned by the Israeli. When I buy the stock, this number that goes up. When the Israeli buys the apartment, this number goes down. So it is a total ownership of assets. If this number is high, you can think of it as Americans lending internationally. If I'm buying a stock or I'm buying a bond in Israel, I'm lending money to Israelis. I'm investing in Israel. The opposite, Americans are borrowing from abroad. So far, so good? Give me yes, no. Okay. Till the early 1980s, America was the largest world creditor. This number was positive and large. Americans owned a lot of assets overseas and lent overseas. Since then, this number has tanked dramatically. Foreigners are buying a lot of American assets and lending to America. This might not be what you would expect to happen if America is a pretty rich country. Why should other countries be lending America money? America is rich. This is sort of unexpected, right? Maybe not. Maybe you guys expect this. Okay, that's certainly a valid argument. This could be that Americans are safe. It is a lot of what's going on here. So we are going to talk about this more next week. Let me give you a little bit of a preview. So that's bullet number 2 is what you just said. Okay, so what's influencing this position? Well, what changes this position is whenever people buy or sell assets, this is going to change. So you can think about the flow of savings. Return on assets is a big deal. So these American assets, how do you think about that? If American assets are safe, do they pay a low amount or do they pay a high amount? Low amount. That's how I would think about it also. Maybe. It's hard to know. But that would go run counter, right? The foreigners should be paying a lot. Doesn't matter. We'll put that off. Okay. So then the question becomes, why do countries behave the way they do? And again, this is a big topic for next week. Okay. Next puzzle, home equity bias puzzle. So I want to think for a second that you guys are Israeli. You live in Israel. Where would you like to invest your money? Do you want to invest it in Israel or do you want to invest it overseas? So maybe. I certainly would. But so let's think for a second, what are the pros about investing in Israel? Well, first of all, investments in Israel are going to be correlated with your own costs. So suppose that things go really well for the country. Israel is growing and the economy is growing. Well, then your investment is going to return a lot of money, just as prices in Israel are going up, right? So maybe it's a good hedge for you. That's the first little bullet point, correlated with personal costs. Second one is knowledge of investments. Suppose what you really want to do is invest in real estate. It's a lot easier for you guys to go around and say, okay, Haifa looks like a good buy right now. Bat Yam looks like a good buy. I can find this apartment or that apartment. The knowledge of your investment is a lot easier if you're buying an apartment within Israel rather than, well, my friend has a cousin in New York who's found an apartment. Not to mention, by the way, all the legal stuff that goes with that. Cost of investing, you don't have to do any currency exchange if you're investing in Israel. The con for investing in Israel is what if Israel falls on hard times? So now suppose that there's a horrible situation in Israel, there's a war, there's a recession, whatever, then your assets are going to lose value, most likely as you're losing your job. So exactly when you need your money, it's gone. So theory would roughly say, this isn't 100% true, but theory would roughly say that you should invest in a country according to its share in the world stock market. So the American stock market is about 55% of the world stock market. Israel's is about 2.2% of the world stock market. So theory would say that you should invest about 55% in America and about 0.2% of your stock holdings should be in Israel. If you actually look at what the pension companies here do, it's not that. They invest way more of their stock in Israel than 0.2%. This is a common thing. It's not just Israel. So I put a survey paper on Moodle for how to think about this. Let me just show you a quick graph, table. So Australia, the Australian stock market is worth about 1.8% of the world stock market. Australians put 75% of their stock holdings into Australian stock. That's really a lot. Brazil, 1.6% of the world stock market, and they put in close to 99% of their money into their own stock market. Why are they doing this? Why aren't they diversifying? So this is the question. And you can just sort of see the countries, what it looks like. Is the question clear? Or, yeah. What? Logistics and taxes can be part of it. But I mean, the numbers are just so huge that it seems like logistics have to be really, really crazy for Brazilians to not buy any American stocks. Maybe they are. Maybe they are. Would you do that with your personal portfolio? Maybe the government would do that, but would you do that? I wouldn't do that either.
Also, the ability of a Chinese citizen to invest in anything other than China, if you're just a random Chinese citizen, you might have a difficult time.
Sure. So, yeah, that's absolutely true. That can potentially help explain what's going on with China. My point here was not to answer the question as much as to raise the question and to point out that there's a paper that gets into it on Moodle for the interested student. But I'm not going to get too into it. All right. Let's talk about the schedule, and then we'll move to the problem set and national income accounting. So starting next week, we're going to talk about balance of payments. Balance of payments is to international economics what national income accounting is to macroeconomics. So it's a lot of accounting, defining terms, things like that. Then we're going to talk about China. When I say China, I mean, why is there a huge trade deficit between America and China? So that's going to be the second half of the lecture next week. Then we're going to move into trade theory. 2 weeks on the Ricardian model. Now, the first week, October 26th, I have to cancel class. I can't be here during class time. So I'm going to pre-record a lecture and upload it. I hope that that's the only time I have to do that this semester. November 9th, we're going to move into the specific factors model and also talk about how to measure the gains from trade from the Jeffersonian embargo. So I'll tell you about that, what that was. Briefly, in 1807, America stopped trading with the rest of the world to protest bad practices by England. And it gives us a nice opportunity to measure the gains from trade. Then we move into the Heckscher-Lin model for a couple of weeks. That's going to be the biggest, heaviest model in terms of calculations and equations and things like that. So the students are going on for the advanced degree. That's for you. Then we're going to do the standard trade model and start moving into the world of economies of scale. So up until this point, we're going to be in perfectly competitive markets. And then we're going to start moving into non-competitive markets. Do 2 weeks of that. Then 2 weeks of trade policy. Then here, I hope, unless I have to like make up something or I didn't finish a topic, I hope to teach one of these topics, maybe like the trade chapter, and then the last week I'll do a review. Now, just like with MacroBet, I posted here when the problem sets will be and when they'll be due. Okay, so questions, comments, concerns? Okay. Let's talk quickly about the problem set. This is already on Moodle. The first article is what do undergrads need to know about trade? So that quote that I gave you towards the beginning of the lecture about how we need a new paradigm of cooperation between businesses and government. There's a made-up quote that goes in here. The first question is asking, okay, Krugman says that imports, not exports, are the purpose of trade. So we're going to go back to that idea and forget about all of mercantilism and all what maybe people still talk about today. Then we're going to get into gravity model readings. So in class, we talked about gravity models sort of between countries or between states. I'm giving you a reading about the gravity model between cities. Another thing, talked about how language is important in the gravity model. You can think about cultural differences or linguistic distance between countries. Maybe Google Translate is getting rid of that. Maybe we have these great algorithms that just let us sort of talk to one another, it doesn't matter what language, and understand one another. So there's a debate in the literature, is that true or not? So one of the articles is required reading, the rebuttal article is not required reading. Then this one is a big paper. That's why I'm emphasizing it. This is the one that's long. This is the 2 waves of globalization. It's talking about the history of globalization before World War I and then after World War II. What are the similarities between them? What are differences between them? How do we think about that? How do they affect inequality between countries, within countries, things like that? I'm emphasizing this for you now because I don't want you to put it off. I don't want you to think, oh, this problem set is due in 3 weeks. I'll start it in 2 weeks. You probably want to start it now. There are 8 sub-questions to question 3. Okay. Questions about problem set 1?
The 2 waves of globalization and what the undergrads need to know are the 2 mandatory ones.
No, and
machine learning.
the intercity one and the machine learning one.
Those are the 4 mandatory ones.
Yes. Yes. Okay. So now we're going to do a quick review of national income accounting, the things that are most important that you remember going into next week. So GDP or income is equal to C, consumption, plus I, investment, plus G, government spending. I think Moshe, when he teaches macro bet, says net exports is the last term. When I teach it, I say the current account, CA, is the last term. At the moment, don't worry about the distinction between the 2 of them. We're going to talk about that next week. Just pick whichever one you remember as being the important one. Savings is income minus consumption minus government spending. CA, it's net exports or CA, whichever one you want to call it. So when I teach macro bet, I really drill in this point in a closed economy. What this is saying is that in a closed economy, so the only way to save on aggregate is to invest. Savings equals investment. The equivalent in an open economy is to say, when you save, you either invest or you invest overseas. So net exports or the current account, I want you to think about that as investing overseas. Driving this point home is the main point of next week's lecture, but you should already be able to see it just from national income accounting. I'm really going to drive this home though next week. A couple other things I want to remind you of quickly. Savings, national savings is made up of private savings and government savings. Government savings is the difference between tax revenue and government spending. This is what the government is saving in principle to pay off debt. Private savings is our income, less what we have to pay in taxes and less what we consume. When you sum up these two, you get total savings. There's one more point I want to drive home and remind you of before I let you go. Let's pretend that we're looking at America. So this is American GDP, C plus I plus G plus American net exports or current account. I'm an American. I buy a bottle of French wine. Where does this show up? In C plus I plus G plus net exports. Net exports is what? Positive, negative? Negative, it's an import. Right, I import a bottle of French wine, it's a negative. Face value, if you're looking at this just at face value, it looks like GDP should be going down when that happens, right? Always never take this equation too much at face value, but at face value, it looks like things go down. It's because it actually also shows up in another place. It is a positive on consumption. So what's going on? Here's the way I want you to think about this. I buy a bottle of French wine, I'm consuming more. But it doesn't make sense to think about that as demand for American goods. That's why we reduce it over here. Okay? So yeah, but you're flipping things and looking on the income side of the national income accounting, right? I'm looking at the expenditures rather than income. It's true that you can look at national income accounting as like wages plus rental income, like that whole thing from macro aleph. I'm skipping that for now. What? Oh, we're just looking at expenditures. Okay. So this is where things show up. Okay, so I guess that's it. I'm going to let you guys go 3 minutes early. See you next week.